Welcome back, everybody, to Captain Patriotic, and hope you guys are doing all right. As you'll recall last week, we talked in great detail about the history behind Veterans Day and how it originally became to be known as Armistice Day, all the way up to being called Veterans Day today. Well, this time I want to take a step back further and further analyze that conflict that started the whole Veterans Day celebration. That's right, guys. Today we are going to be looking into the origins and how the U.S. became involved in what was then called the Great War. Some people even considered it at the time to be the war to end all wars. That's right. So without further ado, let's dig into the causes and what led to the Great War, or World War One, more than 100 years ago. As you guys might have seen in social media, regular media, looking up on the internet, or even if you've played the video game Battlefield 1, you'll come to realize that World War One was a gritty and terrifying war for those who were great involved in it. I mean, a lot of people consider it to be the first, quote, modern war in the world. And that is very true because that is the first war that new technologies came into existence that would change warfare forever, such as modern rifles like the bolt-action rifle. This was the first war to really heavily use machine guns all the time. They used it a lot to mow down people going between the trenches in France. And it was also the war that would lead to other innovations such as the use of cars in combat, modern medicine, as well as the development of like modern hand grenades, the first war to include airplanes in combat for the first time. I mean, there is a lot of technological, psychological, and technological advances during this conflict, including mustard gas and other gases used to weaken your enemy in combat. I mean, it was a gruesome time in history for sure, and one kind of warfare that would define future wars after it. So, before we get into the involvement of the U.S. in this particular conflict, I feel like it's important to get a general perspective of what was going on overseas, which led to the U.S. involved in this gruesome conflict in the first part of the 20th century. As you guys know, or should know, World War One was a very complicated war, and it involved a lot of the major worldly powers like Britain, Germany, Russia, even smaller countries in Africa, and even Japan. So, around the turn of the century, around 1900, the world was at peace and it was prospering. I mean, you have the first modern age of like electricity is just starting to come around. The invention of cars are starting to make surface all over the world. I mean, it's a very peaceful time, and even the art world was progressing very much so during this time. So my question is, with all this peace going around the world at the same time, what ultimately led to a bloody battle and conflict such as World War One? Well, there's actually a few reasons why this whole peacetime talks in the early 1900s led to ultimate warfare that would change the world forever. And the first of those reasons is that all over the world, countries have made, quote, alliances with each other, and they've made a pact with each other in the ultimate event that one country got invaded by another country, that the other alliance would go against the other alliance. In the late 1800s, there was a lot of alliances made, such as between Russia and Serbia, Germany and Austria-Hungary, where modern-day Turkey and Iran and all that is. They were a pact together around the turn of the century. Of course, France and Russia were buddy-buddy with each other, as well as Britain, France, and Belgium. They were a big pact together, and both very big empires. And Japan and Britain were very close allies too, because, the British had this empire that expanded multiple continents around the world. So they were governing multiple parts of the world whenever the First World War broke out. Imagine it like this. that all of these countries are your best friends in school, your best friend in particular. And imagine if a bully were to pick on you so bad that you feel like you couldn't defend yourself anymore. Well, because when you were attacked and your best friend sees it, he wants to get in on the action and he starts attacking the bully that attacked you. Well, that in turn entices the bully's friend to come in and take it out on both of you guys and to defend his buddy. Well, that's basically what these alliances were like during the First World War. It's like, oh, you pick on the little guy, you pick on my best friend, in this case a country, then I'm always going to have his back no matter what. So, with that ideology into place, whenever Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, for a reason we'll get into further down the line, Russia got involved to defend Syria because they had this truce together. And when Germany saw that Russia was mobilizing, they declared war on Russia. But since Russia and France were comrades, France was joining against Germany and Austria-Hungary because, Germany and Austria-Hungary were buddy-buddy with each other. And then Germany attacked France by marching through Belgium, which pulled the British into war since the French and British were so close to each other then. Since now that Britain was involved, Japan became involved because they were really good allies during the First World War, which then ultimately led to other countries such as us to be involved. So another reason besides these alliances that World War I might have started is because you have all these European countries around the world and they're trying to claim territories in other parts of the world such as Africa and India. Well, when those countries started to become quote, rulers of that certain part of the world, they became really invested in the goods and the money that they had invested in those countries. And whenever one country declared war on another pack of each other, they felt like their resources would be cut off if for some reason they were to be taken over during this conflict. And that's why everyone took such offense to each other declaring war on each other. Because they feel like if they lost a territory, they'd be losing money for their empire or their country and all that fun stuff. So yeah, it was a very, very big ordeal. One of the other things I was going around the turn of the century about this time is that since all of these European countries were involved in colonialism, imperialism, and taking over all these smaller countries like different parts of Africa, for instance, there started to become an arms race or competition between one of the countries and the other one as far as like having the best military, army, navy, having the most warships or guns at the ready, as well as training individual citizens of each country to be ready for war no matter what the cost. And this wasn't in such a place like Germany, who was a freshly new country in the late 1800s. It was for everybody, including Britain, who had been around for so long. Everyone basically wanted to modernize their armies and prepare them for the worst in this new century. So whenever a war would come up in the future, all men would be ready for whatever kind of warfare would come into play. But the immediate cause that would throw everyone around the world into this world war directly comes from the assassination of one particular individual, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Now, he was the ruler of Austria-Hungary, and, they wanted to take over parts of Serbia. The Serbians didn't want anything to do with being a part of Austria-Hungary. I mean, they were totally oppositional about it. It'd be just like having an LSU Tiger fan go up against an Alabama team. They really hate each other's guts. Well, this is very similar to what Serbia had feelings like against Austria-Hungary. They wanted no part of that kingdom whatsoever. Well, it was in June of 1914 that a Serbian terrorist group called the Black Hand was actually sent to assassinate the Archduke. And there was one attempt where one of the Black Hand members actually threw a hand grenade at the driver that the Archduke was riding in, but the driver missed the grenade and it didn't go off, killing the Archduke initially. But there was a second attempt where one of the members, called Gavril Princip, actually pulled out a gun on the Archduke, and he was at point-blank range between him and his mistress that were riding in the car at the same time. They could avoid a grenade, but no one, it's very hard to dodge a bullet, right? Well, that's what he did. Princeps shot so many times into the car, which ultimately led to both the Archduke and his wife into critical condition and where they ultimately died of their wounds. Well, once the Archduke and his wife died, that led to Austria-Hungary declaring war on Serbia, which then turned to Russia backing up Serbia because they have this big alliance going between them. And then when Russia began to mobilize its forces with Serbia, Germany ultimately declared war on Russia because, Germany and Austria-Hungary are big allies at this point in history. And like I said before, each country would do anything to back the other up and help them out so much. So when all these alliances started declaring war on each other, eventually the British got involved and it just became a huge mess. So over here in Europe, with all the wars going on, the U.S. is over here looking at it like, no, this is a big nasty war. We don't want to be involved in this at any point or another. I think we're going to stay neutral, basically is what our president said at the time. Because they felt like, even though we were imperialistic powers at the time too, by that point we had acquired the Philippines and Guam and a couple of other territories, that we didn't see war as a way to do that. We wanted to totally stay out of European affairs whatsoever. So we actually declared neutrality from the conflict for a good 2.5 years before we were actually pulled into the war. So which leads me to my next point. Why did the U.S. have to become involved in such a global conflict that could have been avoided in the first place? Well, let me tell you, there was a lot of points that ultimately swayed the U.S. government to change its mind. And I'm sure it wasn't an easy decision to make either, but there was enough factors going on to cause us to get involved in that conflict. So, in which I'd like to go over now. So, whenever war broke out in July of 1914, the Germans had a tactic of trying to sink with their submarines Allied and British ships that are going into port, from the U.S., because at the time, even though we didn't have any men over there fighting in the trenches, we were greatly involved with the production of firearms and tanks and other pieces of war to help our allies, especially the British, help them fight their war since they were so involved in the conflict they couldn't produce arms of their own at the time. So at the very beginning of the war and into 1915, the Germans started to use a tactic called unrestricted submarine warfare, where basically if they suspected a ship to be involved with one of the allies that they were going up against, they could fire on and sink that ship with no questions asked. They could do it at any point or another. Well, that tactic actually worked for Germany in the very first part of the war. It really did. It caused a disturbing effect on the Allies in the very first year of the war. But what it did not do, is keep the United States at bay, and that ultimately changed our mind about Germany, because in early 1915, there was a boat out in the Atlantic that was coming from the U.S. called the Lusitania, which it was a carrier ship carrying a bunch of supplies for the British and the French and what have you. The Germans spot this ship on May 1st, 1915, and noticed that it was bound for Liverpool in Britain. Well, they kept on following this ship for days and days until it almost gets into port, into Liverpool. Well, it was on May 7th, 1915, that they spotted the ship off the coast of Ireland by a U-20 German submarine, where it actually fired on the Lusitania, which caused almost 1,200 people on that ship to lose their lives. And among those dead were nearly 130 Americans, which being involved in a war for almost a year at that point and having this tragedy happen in Allied waters, that really didn't settle well with the U.S. government, because they were really PO'd that 130 of their Americans were killed by what they felt was unnecessarily gunfire from the Germans. And so that really did not settle well with the Americans whatsoever. So the Germans kept on doing this and doing this and doing this, and finally, after a while, the president and the government basically told Germany, it's like, hey, lay off on the unrestricted warfare, because that's not doing anything to help us or help you. And they basically warned them, if they were to resume unrestricted warfare, that the U.S. would more than likely be involved in the conflict and declare war on Germany. So, I mean, Germany listened, and they stopped doing unrestricted warfare for a little while. They really did. So tensions really started to die down at this point. And the next point that I have is, like I mentioned earlier, even though America didn't have any ground troops over in Europe fighting, they really did support all of the allies overseas by providing them with materials for the war effort. I mean, they were building guns and weapons and tanks and all this and sending it over to directly aid the Allies in defeating Germany and Austria-Hungary and all the other Central Powers. It was America's thinking that, well, the Allies better win, and if they don't, then it's going to cost us a lot of money, because America loaned, for, say, the British, they loaned them so much money in aid that they really wanted the British to pay them back eventually after the war was over for all the stuff that we provided for them. So in the back of their mind, their thing is like, well, if they get defeated, then there's a chance that we're never going to get that money back that we loaned out to you guys to begin with, which was true. And that's why tensions were growing between Germany and the U.S., because they kept on agonizing them and basically threatening to throw their supply of ships and guns and all that to their allies to help win in what seemed like an unbeatable war in the first part of the conflict. So, you know how I told you that the U.S. threatened Germany with war if they would resume unrestricted warfare? Well, Germany listened to the U.S. for a very long time, at least a little bit, but then they decided to resume unrestricted warfare again in 1917. And at this point in history, the war in Europe had been going on just over 2 years, and I guess the Germans felt desperate, and they wanted to do something to change the tide of the war back in their favor because they were starting to lose the war over there. Well, that was when they decided to resume unrestricted warfare, but this time they knew very well that the U.S. would declare war on them if they were to do this, and I guess they felt like they were prepared to do it because, man, they did anyway. They didn't even blink their eye about it. And it was during February and March of 1917 that a lot of U.S. cargo vessels actually sunk without warning, which ultimately led us to sever ties with Germany altogether because they wouldn't listen to us after all these 2 years of warning. So that ultimately drew us closer to war. So that is the third strike in all of this. Now, this next event is what ultimately pulled us into the conflict altogether. We're like, hey, this is it. This is the last straw. We really need to get involved here to protect our liberties and rights and people and our allies. And everything was going good except for the unrestricted warfare, and we were supplying the allies over in Britain and everything. But what ultimately changed the goal and the thinking of the U.S. government and the people's perspective on the war changed in January of 1917 when a German diplomatic representative in Mexico actually received a telegram from the German Foreign Security Secretary, Arthur Zimmermann. And in that telegram, it basically proposed a quote, secret alliance between Germany and Mexico. And Germany was proposing to Mexico that if they were to join Germany and the other Central Powers in the war, that Germany would promise Mexico the return of U.S. states at the time of Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, even California. They were basically giving Mexico false hope for joining the Central Powers and ultimately trying to be able to attack the U.S. at home. Well, needless to say, that didn't settle well with the American public and the president, much less Woodrow Wilson, who was totally opposed to war altogether. But unfortunately, Germany had this grand scheme and they thought, oh, we could finally find a way to win this war again. Little did they know that that telegram was actually intercepted by the British and sent over to the American government ahead of time before any plan was actually put into action. And let's just say, when the British finally sent us that telegram and they intercepted it, and we're like, oh, no, heck no, we're not going to go for that. So that was the ultimate and final warning from the U.S. They're basically like, we're not going to deal with this. We're being bullied by Germany over here. We'll show them who's big and bad. Let's go declare war on Germany. It took them a few months to finally decide to go to war. I mean, it was a huge debate for a while in the government. But then, finally, on April 6, 1917, with a majority vote in both the House and the Senate, we finally declared war on Germany. And our first set of troops were actually sent over to Europe in June of 1917. So, as you can see, the U.S. becoming involved in this conflict was not an easy decision at all. It really wasn't, unlike some people might make it seem to be. It's a lot more involved than a lot of us realize it is, but if it wasn't for all these factors, then we probably would have stayed out of the First World War. We would not have been involved. But if Germany hadn't have been as persistent as it was with winning the war, then yeah, we probably wouldn't have gotten involved. But now that they did, of course, history wouldn't be the same if we weren't involved. So stay tuned in for next week, where I will go into great detail on American battles that were greatly involved in World War I and how the U.S. basically helped the Allies win the Great War in 1918. Thank you guys so much for tuning in, and leave a like in the comments, subscribe to me, and stay tuned in for next week, you guys. Thank you so very much, and have a great one.